In a world that moves too fast, speaks too loud, and demands too much, stillness has become an act of rebellion. They say you're weak when you pause, that you're scared when you don't speak, that silence means surrender. But what if it doesn't? What if silence isn't absence, but presence in its purest form? What if stillness is not you freezing, but you standing so rooted in your truth that nothing shakes you? The world, or rather the people who thrive in noise, can't stand stillness. Not because it's boring, but because it reveals. Stillness is a mirror, and most people don't like what they see when the noise dies. That's why they provoke, that's why they poke, that's why they scream at calm people, because silence forces them to hear themselves, and what they hear scares them. You see, there are people who survive only through movement, emotional movement. They provoke arguments not because they want answers, but because they want control. They don't crave connection. They crave compliance. If they can keep you flinching, defending, explaining, they're still running the show. But when you stop reacting, when your eyes stop pleading, when your body stops leaning forward and starts leaning back, that's when they panic. They say, "Why aren't you saying anything?" But they don't ask because they want to listen. They ask because they need material. And when you give them none, they start spinning. You become unreadable, uncontrollable. And in their world, control is everything. They think silence is a vacuum, but it's not. It's a boundary. It says, "I've stopped dancing to your tune, and I'm okay with the quiet." Most people aren't. Stillness isn't passive. It's not what you do when you're out of moves. It's what you choose when you've realized the game isn't worth playing. Toxic people play emotional chess, moving guilt, gaslighting, and drama-like pieces. But what happens when you stand up and walk away from the board? They don't lose because you checkmate them. They lose because you stopped playing. They'll call you cold. They'll call you heartless. But what they won't say out loud is this: they've lost their grip. Your reaction used to be their anchor. Now you're floating above the storm, no longer pulled into their gravity. That's terrifying to them, not because you're gone, but because you didn't leave the way they expected. You didn't scream. You didn't slam the door. You just stopped responding. And silence, clean silence. Not the kind full of suppressed rage, but the kind rooted in clarity, is louder than any retaliation. It doesn't plead. It doesn't persuade. It just is. And that just is becomes unbearable to those who live off chaos. Because silence doesn't lie. It doesn't distort. It holds up a mirror and whispers, "Look." They want you to come back, not because they miss you, but because without your attention, their show has no audience, their script has no purpose. They thrived when you were spinning, doubting, explaining. Now they're unraveling in the silence you left behind. Not your words, not your fists, your absence. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "If you are disturbed by external things, it is not they that trouble you, but your own judgment of them. In stillness, you reclaim that judgment. You stop letting someone else's chaos dictate your internal weather, and when you stop dancing to noise, you begin to hear your own rhythm again." They used to say, "You've changed." And they're right. You have. You've changed the channel, you've changed the script, you've changed who gets access to your inner peace. They say silence is dangerous because it can be misunderstood. But sometimes silence is dangerous because it can't be manipulated. You can twist words. You can't twist quiet. So no, stillness isn't surrender. It's strategy. It's not hiding. It's healing. And to those who depended on your brokenness, your calm will always feel like a threat, because you didn't fight them. You didn't debate them, you just grew beyond them. People often ask, but don't they deserve to be told the truth? Don't I need to defend myself? Number Because some people don't want truth. They want drama. They want a reaction they can manipulate, misquote, and remold into a new narrative where they're the hero or the victim but never the villain. When you give them nothing, you take away their power to reframe the scene. Stillness starves the story they were scripting. Toxic people don't fear confrontation. They feed off it. It gives them content. It keeps you engaged. What they fear deeply is the clean withdrawal of your emotional energy. Because they didn't feed on your love. They fed on your availability, your attention, your validation. The moment you stop explaining yourself is the moment they lose their ability to cast you in the role they assigned you. The overreactor, the fixer, the emotional responder. When you stop defending yourself, you force them to face themselves. And they can't. They've spent years running from that. So they lash out. Not because you've hurt them, but because you've removed their shield, your emotional labor. You're no longer softening their consequences. You're no longer translating their chaos into something manageable. Now, their dysfunction stands alone, naked, unfiltered, and it burns. They'll say you're cold, emotionally unavailable, hard. But, truthfully, what they're seeing isn't cruelty, it's clarity. For the first time, they're encountering a version of you that's no longer willing to carry their emotional baggage. You didn't get cruel, you got clean. And that shift is threatening because it means they're finally accountable for their own mess. This is where Stoicism becomes power, not philosophy. The Stoics didn't detach because they lacked feeling. They detached because they valued their inner world more than outer chaos. To them, protecting your peace wasn't selfish, it was essential. When you live by that standard, people who thrived on your emotional availability will call it selfish. That's fine. Let them. You no longer need their approval. That's the real liberation. The truth is, you were never safe in their world. Your emotions were tools. Your confessions were future weapons. Your kindness was a soft spot they kept pressing, just to see how much you'd take. But silence? Silence doesn't have a handle. It can't be grabbed, twisted, or turned against you. It terrifies them because it gives them nothing to work with. And so, for the first time, they're forced to face the weight of their own emptiness with no one left to blame. In this stillness, you realize something. You were never overreacting. You were over, feeling in a place that rewarded numbness. You were over, explaining in a world that didn't want to understand. You were overgiving in a relationship that only knew how to take. The moment you withdraw, not out of anger, but awareness, you take back your power, not by shouting, but by simply not participating. And that is what ends the cycle. That's what breaks the loop. That's what leaves them screaming into the void. Because you didn't give them closure. You didn't give them the meltdown they were hoping for. You didn't bleed for them one last time so they could feel important. You just walked away. And in doing so, you became their silence. You see, true power doesn't beg to be seen. It doesn't chase understanding. It simply is. Like gravity, like a mountain, like a soul that's done apologizing for its boundaries. The quieter you become, the more clearly you hear who's worth your voice. And spoiler alert, most aren't. Silence doesn't mean you didn't care. It means you cared enough to stop proving it. It means you cared about your sanity more than their approval. It means you're finally living in a space they can't reach, not because you blocked them, but because they no longer exist in the version of you that's at peace. They say silence is the absence of sound, but in the emotional realm, silence is the presence of self. It is the full weight of your spirit, no longer invested in dysfunction. And the truth is, some people were never scared of losing you. They were scared of losing access to your energy. Now they have, and it's not revenge, it's reality. They'll try one more thing, one last performance. Because manipulators don't go silent, they go louder, louder with their guilt trips, louder with their narratives, louder with their victimhood. Not because they believe it, but because they hope you still do. They're betting you'll flinch. That somewhere inside, there's still a version of you who can't stand to be misunderstood, who needs to defend your name, who needs to be seen as the good one. That's the version they can reach. That's the version they lost. Now you don't explain, you don't engage, you don't perform, and to them, that's unbearable. Because your silence doesn't just remove your words, it removes their weapon. And it forces them into the very space they've avoided their entire life. Self-reflection. That's why they scream louder. Not because you hurt them, but because your absence removes their favorite shield you. You used to cushion every blow, patch every wound, and rewrite every conflict so it wouldn't break them. You were their filter, their translation, their emotional escape hatch. But you finally realized, that's not love, that's labor. And you're not here to be someone's emotional janitor cleaning up the messes they keep creating and blaming you for. The Stoic doesn't react because he knows the battlefield is internal. He doesn't need to win a war of words because his victory isn't external. His win is peace. And peace doesn't yell, it doesn't argue. It doesn't debate with dysfunction, it just walks out quietly and closes the door. You know you've grown when your silence isn't cold, it's clear. When it doesn't come from bitterness, but boundaries. When you stop explaining your worth and start living it. And when people try to drag you back into the storm with insults, projections, and twisted truths, you don't rise to fight. You let them shout into their own echo chamber, because you no longer need the last word. You've already spoken the final sentence the moment you stopped responding. To those who manipulate, this is the ultimate rejection. Not being yelled at, not being punished, but being ignored with dignity. You didn't slam the door, you didn't burn the bridge. You simply stopped crossing it. And that haunts them, because it means they weren't even worth the closure. Just stillness, just space, just nothing. And for people who live through chaos, nothingness is death. But for you, that same silence is rebirth. It's the moment you return to yourself. When you realize your peace doesn't require anyone else's permission. When you stop shrinking to fit into people's broken understanding of who you are. That is where power begins. Stillness doesn't mean you don't feel. It means you no longer bleed for those who keep cutting. It means you've turned inward not to hide, but to heal. And when they come knocking again, because they always do, you won't answer. Not because you're avoiding, but because you've outgrown the question. You used to wonder, what if they misunderstand me? Now you ask, what if I spend my life trying to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding me? That shift is everything. There is no peace in convincing someone of your value. Peace comes when you know it and live like it. And when you walk like someone who no longer needs approval, people notice. The ones who loved your chaos will call you arrogant. The ones who thrived on your guilt will say you've changed, and they'll be right. You have. You've stopped performing. You've stopped leaking energy into people who never saw your worth until you withdrew it. Now they feel the weight of your absence, not because you wanted to hurt them, but because you finally stopped hurting yourself. Let them spiral. Let them twist stories. Let them accuse you of things that sound dramatic but make no real sense. That's all they have left: noise. And the beautiful thing about silence is that it doesn't compete with noise. It waits, it listens, and when the noise dies down, it's the only thing left standing. That's where you'll be. Still, grounded, free. Sometimes, people mistake your calm for coldness, your silence for distance, your peace for pride. Let them. You're not here to fix their perception. You're here to protect your energy. And that's a shift only healed people understand. Because when you're still wounded, silence feels like abandonment. But when you've healed, silence becomes your sanctuary. It's where you reconnect with yourself, not as the version who had to survive, but as the one who finally gets to live. This is where everything changes, where you begin living from intention, not reaction, where your time becomes sacred, your presence selective, your words few but grounded. Not because you think you're above anyone, but because you've realized not everyone deserves access. Your peace isn't for public consumption, it's a private frequency, and only those who carry stillness in their own hearts can even hear it. That's why when you stop reacting, people call you hard to read. But you're not hard to read, you're hard to manipulate now. They can't get a rise out of you because you've mastered your breath. You've learned that emotional stillness isn't detachment, it's dominance over self. They can rage, they can lie, they can provoke, but your calm remains. And that calm is a language they never learned to speak. There was a time you would have argued back. A time you would have written long paragraphs trying to explain your side. A time you would have gone sleepless trying to fix what they broke while blaming you for the wreckage. But not anymore. Now, your silence is your signature. It says, I see the game, but I no longer play. And that message is louder than anything you could post, say, or shout. Silence is not submission, it's separation, a declaration that you no longer live where dysfunction feels like home, that you no longer offer your nervous system as a playground for someone else's storms. You don't engage because you're above them. You don't engage because you've left the room entirely. And now, they're shouting at a ghost of the person they used to control. But you're not that ghost. You're flesh and breath and clarity. You're real, and they can't touch what's no longer present. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Nowhere can man find a quieter or more untroubled retreat than in his own soul." This isn't just poetic, it's practical. Because when the world becomes loud, when people become unhinged, when lies get louder than truth, the soul becomes a shelter. But only if you've learned to live in it, and most haven't. That's why they chase chaos. Because quiet terrifies them. They haven't made peace with themselves, so they can't stand the sound of their own minds. But you're learning. Maybe not perfectly, maybe not instantly, but you're learning to sit in silence without fidgeting, to pause without panicking, to say, I don't need to respond right now. I don't need to explain this. I don't need to win this moment. That's not weakness. That's mastery. You don't need to win the argument. You just need to exit the circus. And when you do, everything becomes clearer. You see who was there for connection and who was there for control, who loved you in your peace and who only loved you when you were manageable. That's what silence reveals, who stays when they can't read you, reach you, or regulate you. And let's be honest, not many will. People don't leave because you stopped talking. They leave because you stopped feeding the dynamic. You stopped validating their emotional immaturity. You stopped playing the fix-me game while destroying yourself in the process. Your silence broke the cycle not because you disappeared, but because you finally appeared in your own life. You're not hiding anymore. You're healing. You're not passive. You're powerful. You're not detached. You're discerning. And from that stillness, you've found your most dangerous weapon, self-respect. They called your silence selfish, but the truth is they were just addicted to your noise. And now that you're quiet, their chaos has nothing to cling to. Let them spin. Let them search. Let them scream into the stillness. It's not your storm anymore. One of the most misunderstood forms of power is non-reaction. People think if you don't respond, you must be weak, scared, or avoiding the truth. But the deeper reality is this. Sometimes silence is the most intentional move you can make. It's not withdrawal, it's wisdom. You're not dodging the blow. You're choosing not to swing, because not everything thrown at you is worth catching, and not every insult deserves a reply. You start realizing that the loudest voice in the room is rarely the wisest, that people who need to dominate conversations are often the ones most disconnected from themselves. And so, instead of matching their volume, you match your values. You don't yell louder, you just stand still, calm, centered. Not to prove a point, but to protect your peace. That's when they unravel. Because now, you're no longer accessible in the way they're used to. You're no longer flinching at every jab, no longer answering every accusation, no longer offering clarity to people who enjoy misunderstanding you. Your silence has become sacred space. And to those who thrived on your chaos, that space feels like suffocation. But here's what you've learned. Silence isn't avoidance. It's emotional discipline. It's saying, I won't allow someone else's immaturity to control my nervous system. It's knowing that peace is not something you demand from the world, it's something you build within. And once you've built it, you don't give it away cheaply. They'll try to bait you, through shame, through guilt, through sudden kindness that feels like a setup. They'll ask, what happened to you? You used to be so understanding. But what they really mean is, you used to tolerate my dysfunction. Why don't you anymore? And the answer is simple. Because you grew. You're not reacting because you're heartless. You're not silent because you're cruel. You've simply stopped being available for chaos. And to people who depended on your emotional availability for their own sense of control, that feels like betrayal. But it's not betrayal. It's boundaries. There's a moment in everyone's journey when they realize they've been trying to rescue people who weren't drowning, just comfortable swimming in dysfunction. That's the day you stop trying to save them. That's the day you start saving yourself. And in that silence, something beautiful happens. You start hearing things you couldn't hear before. The sound of your own breath, the rhythm of your own thoughts. The whisper of your intuition finally getting a chance to speak after being drowned out by noise. And it tells you something you never fully believed before. You are enough, even without explaining yourself. You don't owe everyone a response. You don't owe everyone your energy. You don't have to justify your boundaries, your peace, your decision to walk away from conversations that leave you drained. You don't have to prove your goodness to people committed to misunderstanding it. You can simply choose peace, choose space, choose stillness. And while they're throwing stones into your silence, hoping to hear an echo, there is none, because you've stopped building houses out of other people's opinions. You've stopped decorating your identity with their praise or their blame. Now, you live in your own truth, and it's quiet here, but it's also solid. It's also real. There was a time when you needed their validation to feel safe. But now, your safety comes from alignment. You sleep better now not because everything is perfect, but because you're no longer fighting battles that don't belong to you. You don't chase closure anymore. You give it to yourself. They'll call it ego, they'll call it pride. But your stillness is not arrogance, it's reclamation. You've returned to yourself. And the moment you did, everything that no longer aligned began to fall away, not because you pushed it, but because it couldn't survive in the frequency you've elevated to. You're no longer part of the performance. You've left the theater. And the stage is empty now, no matter how loud the actors scream. That's the power of silence. It doesn't compete. It just ends the scene. Peace isn't something you stumble into. It's something you defend. Daily. Relentlessly, not with aggression but with clarity, because once you've built inner stillness, the world will test it. People will test it. Old patterns will whisper that it's safer to go back to react, to explain, to try one more time to be understood by someone who never listened in the first place. But the new version of you, the one who's walked through fire and found silence on the other side, that version no longer lives in reaction. It lives in intention. And here's what most don't realize. Calm isn't your natural state. It's your chosen one. Chosen every time someone tries to provoke you, and you don't take the bait. Chosen when someone distorts the truth, and you let it go uncorrected. Chosen when you realize that some relationships aren't meant to be resolved, they're meant to be released. Because resolution is only possible where there is mutual honesty, vulnerability, and respect. Without those, every conversation is a trap, a performance, a manipulation. And no matter how well you speak, you will always be cast as the villain in someone else's script if their ego demands it. That's why you don't speak to be understood anymore. You speak when it's worth your peace, and when it's not, you stay silent. Not because you have nothing to say, but because some people haven't earned the right to hear you anymore. You've learned this the hard way. Not everyone who asks, "What's wrong?" wants to help. Some want to collect your pain like ammunition. Some want to analyze you, not comfort you. Some want to poke around in your vulnerability just to remind themselves they still matter. That's why the more healed you become, the less you speak in certain rooms. You can feel when the space isn't sacred. You can sense when presence is performative. So you don't share. You don't explain. You observe, not from distance, but from discernment. Stillness isn't silence for silence's sake. It's clarity. It's a refusal to pour gold into broken jars. It's the deep knowing that not everyone deserves to witness your growth, your softness, your grace. Those things are earned, not demanded. And when you stop giving them away freely, people call you changed. But the truth is, you finally stopped handing out pieces of yourself to people who didn't value them. That's why this silence feels so different. It's not hollow, it's whole. It's not empty, it's filled with everything you used to lose in the noise. Your intuition, your peace, your self-worth, your presence. All of it returning now that you've stopped chasing conversations that never nourished you. This is the lesson most never learn. Your power isn't in how loudly you speak, it's in how deeply you listen. Not just to others, but to yourself. To that inner knowing that says, "This isn't mine to carry. This isn't love. This isn't respect. This doesn't feel safe." The more you honor that voice, the less tempted you are to betray yourself just to maintain a connection that's already broken. And when people try to pull you back into their chaos, because they will, you don't resist with anger. You simply don't move. You don't rise to defend yourself. You don't fall for the bait. You don't swing when provoked. You stand still, anchored, and in that stillness, they reveal more than you ever could by speaking. Because that's what Stoic stillness does. It's not about silencing the noise. It's about becoming immune to it. It's about refusing to let outside volume shake your internal stability. It's about moving from defense to discernment, from survival to sovereignty. They'll try to reopen the story, to rewrite the ending, to pull you back into the old dynamic where your role was to react, to absorb, to rescue, to prove. But the difference now is you don't play those roles anymore. You've retired from that performance. You've reclaimed your seat in the audience of your own life, watching, learning, choosing, free. And maybe they don't understand it. Maybe they never will. But that's not your concern. Understanding is not a requirement for moving on. Closure is not a prerequisite for peace. You don't owe anyone a final word. Sometimes your healing is the only closure they'll ever get. And your silence, the only goodbye they'll ever hear. There is a moment subtle, almost unnoticeable when the silence shifts. At first, it felt like grief, the absence, the withdrawal, the lack of noise you once mistook for connection. You sat in it, wondering if maybe you had made a mistake by stepping back, if maybe your silence had said too much, if maybe you should have said just one more thing to clear the air. But eventually, that silence doesn't feel like grief anymore. It feels like relief. because you realize you're no longer rehearsing conversations that will never happen. You're no longer trying to explain a truth someone has no intention of hearing. You're no longer trying to edit yourself into someone's idea of who you should be. That's the shift, the liberation. The moment you move from reaction to resolution, not because anything outside of you changed, but because you changed your response to it. And from that moment on, you're no longer in emotional servitude to people who manipulate through guilt, confusion, or chaos. You don't need to slam doors anymore. You don't need to write monologues they'll never read with honesty. You don't even need to defend your absence, because true healing doesn't announce itself. It just shows up as peace, as distance, as silence, as stillness. And when they notice you're no longer there emotionally, mentally, energetically, it's not because you're hiding, it's because they lost access. They burned the bridge, and now they're shouting from across a gap they created. Let them echo into the space you've reclaimed for yourself. You see, Stoic stillness is not avoidance. It's presence without performance. It's showing up to life with your dignity intact. No longer explaining why you're not engaging with dysfunction. No longer negotiating your standards for the sake of comfort. You just walk, you leave, you remain unmoved, not because you're cruel, but because you're clear. And that clarity scares them more than anything, because it tells a truth they cannot manipulate, that you've returned to yourself, that you've stopped orbiting around their moods, their projections, their crises, that your peace is no longer dependent on their apology or their validation or their version of events. That's what makes silence so powerful. It doesn't just end conversations, it ends illusions. The illusion that they had control, the illusion that you needed them to be whole, the illusion that your value was ever up for negotiation. And when you carry that kind of silence firm, rooted, unshakable, it becomes your armor, not to hide behind, but to protect the sanctuary you've built within. No one gets to enter without respect, without honesty, without consistency, because now you're no longer entertaining potential. You're responding only to patterns, and if the pattern is chaos, you don't enter the dance. You walk away from the music. You don't flinch at accusations. You don't justify your healing. You don't explain your peace, because the moment you start explaining, you give them room to twist your words again. But silence? Silence has no handles. Nothing to hold, nothing to twist, nothing to weaponize. And in that silence, they're forced to face what they've spent years avoiding themselves. That's why they call your stillness cold. That's why they label your peace as pride. Not because it is, but because it exposes their fragility. It unmasks the dependency they wrapped in control, the need for attention they called love, the performance they believed was truth. But you see it now. You see how every reaction used to cost you something. A little more peace, a little more self-trust, a little more time you'll never get back. And now you've made a vow. No more. No more reacting to people committed to misunderstanding you. No more dancing to the rhythm of someone else's instability. No more being emotionally available to those who are emotionally irresponsible. You've chosen stillness. And in that stillness, you've chosen power. Not the power to dominate, but the power to be undisturbed. To no longer participate in dynamics that break you down just to build someone else up. You're not here to be someone's mirror, punching bag, therapist, or fixer. You're here to be whole, to be free, to be you. And now, your silence speaks volumes. It says, I don't fear your chaos. I've simply stopped participating in it. I'm not gone. I'm just not available on those terms anymore. There comes a time when you realize you're not healing to return to who you were. You're healing to become someone new, someone who no longer flinches when misunderstood, someone who no longer rushes to explain their boundaries, someone who doesn't view walking away as weakness, but as wisdom. You don't owe access to everyone who had it before. That version of you, so available, so reactive, so easy to guilt, is gone, and in their place stands someone quieter, but deeper, calmer, but stronger, less visible, but more rooted. It's easy to mistake this evolution for coldness. Let them. Growth isn't meant to be understood by those who stayed the same. They might say you've changed. That's the point. You've stopped confusing loyalty with self-sacrifice. You've stopped calling your anxiety empathy. You've stopped shrinking yourself to fit into someone else's broken world. Now you're creating your own. And not everyone fits. That's not cruelty. That's clarity. Stillness has shown you that not everyone is meant to sit at your table, not because you're better, but because you've stopped dining where you're disrespected. You've stopped speaking where your voice echoes back in distortion. You've stopped showing up where you're only invited to be blamed, gaslit, or controlled. And when they call your silence passive-aggressive, remember this: the only people who fear your stillness are those who once depended on your chaos. They're not disturbed because you've gone silent. They're disturbed because they can no longer extract power from you. You've taken it back. Quietly, firmly, without a performance. Because when you stop reacting, when you stop explaining, when you stop rushing to defend your worth to the unworthy, you become a mirror, and the reflection they see is no longer your responsibility, it's theirs. They used to call you emotional because you cried. Now you're called cold because you no longer respond. But both were projections. Neither were ever the truth. The truth is, you were never too sensitive. You were too generous. With your time, your empathy, your energy. You were taught that being good meant being available. That love meant always giving one more chance. That silence meant defeat. But now you know, silence is not defeat. It is definition. It says, this is where I end and you begin. It says, you don't get to write this story anymore. It says, you don't get to confuse me into staying. Because stillness is how you unlearn survival, how you unhook yourself from toxic roles like the fixer, the forgiver, the explainer, the absorber. You're not here to be consumed. You're here to be whole. And being whole means protecting your peace at the cost of being misunderstood. Being whole means letting people mislabel your quiet as bitterness, as ego, as arrogance, while you stay grounded in truth. Because you know something they don't, that your silence is not about them, it's about you, your healing, your clarity, your freedom. You've learned that you don't heal by proving your side. You heal by walking away from the debate entirely. Not with rage, not with a dramatic exit, but with stillness that says, I've got nothing left to prove and nothing left to lose. This is how you end the cycle. Not with screaming, not with retaliation, but with stillness. You let the dysfunction echo into itself. You let the lies hang in the air unchallenged. You let the drama unravel, untouched by your energy. And in doing so, you reclaim something priceless, your inner authority. You decide what deserves your energy. You decide who gets access. You decide when to speak and when to stay silent. Not because you're trying to win, but because you've already won. The moment you chose peace over participation, you won. They'll feel your absence and call it betrayal. But what they're really feeling is withdrawn permission. The permission you once gave them to manipulate your emotions, to spin your words, to question your reality. That permission is gone. Stillness doesn't seek to hurt. It simply refuses to be hurt again. It doesn't seek revenge. It simply no longer offers vulnerability where it was once violated. And in this silence, you rise not above them, but back to yourself. Because healing isn't about becoming untouchable, it's about becoming unshakable. And sometimes the loudest declaration you'll ever make is not reacting at all. This is the truth. The person who can remain calm in the face of chaos doesn't do so because life has been easy. They do so because they've lived through emotional war zones and made a sacred vow: never again. Never again will I trade my peace for approval. Never again will I bleed to keep someone else comfortable. Never again will I hand over the reins of my nervous system to anyone who thrives on disorder. Stillness wasn't gifted. It was earned. Through heartbreak, through manipulation, through every conversation where you weren't heard, and every apology that never came. Through nights of questioning your sanity, trying to figure out how loving someone turned into walking on eggshells. You don't arrive at peace by accident. You arrive because you fought for it. Quietly, internally, over and over. And now, here you are. A storm no longer pretending to be a calm breeze. A spirit no longer caged by guilt. A heart no longer beating to someone else's rhythm. You're here, not because you won, but because you stopped playing. And maybe they'll never understand. Maybe they'll accuse you of being cold, or selfish, or distant. That's okay. Let them misunderstand. That's the cost of being misunderstood by people who only listened when you agreed with them. You see, peace doesn't always look like soft music and incense. Sometimes peace looks like no longer texting back, no longer explaining why you're leaving, no longer defending your softness to the people who used it like a weapon. You don't need to justify your distance to those who created the space in the first place. They had access to the real you, the vulnerable you, the forgiving you, the emotionally generous you, and they mistook that for weakness. But silence? Silence has no loopholes, no emotional door left cracked open, no proof for them to twist, and that's what scares them most. You didn't just leave, you left well. Marcus Aurelius said, "Nowhere you can go is more peaceful, more free of interruptions than your own soul." And now you understand that peace isn't just freedom from noise, it's freedom from need. You no longer need to fix it, to be liked, to be understood. You only need to be true to yourself. Stillness is not avoidance, it's alignment. Not weakness, but wisdom. Not silence, but strategy. Because now you don't raise your voice, you raise your standard. You don't chase closure, you create it within. You don't retaliate, you remove yourself. You no longer participate in arguments that go in circles. You no longer prove your kindness to those committed to seeing you as cruel. You no longer stretch your heart for people who never bothered to meet you halfway. They may scream into the silence. They may provoke, distort, accuse. But you no longer respond, not because you can't, but because you choose not to. You're not avoiding confrontation, you're refusing contamination. Because now, your peace is your priority. Not revenge, not justice, not being right, just peace. The kind that lets you sleep at night. The kind that makes you walk differently. Stand taller. Breathe slower. And it's not just for you. Your silence doesn't just end cycles. It sets new ones in motion. Because the moment you stop reacting, others feel it too. They sense the shift. They realize their usual tactics don't land, that their chaos doesn't stick, that you've become unreadable not because you're hiding, but because you've outgrown the frequency they operate on. That's the ultimate revolution. Not louder screams, but quieter boundaries. Not public declarations, but private detachment. You don't perform peace. You become it, not for them, for you. And that's what Stoicism always taught: not to suppress, but to center, not to avoid conflict, but to no longer internalize it, not to harden your heart, but to protect its rhythm. The Stoics didn't deny emotion. They trained themselves not to be ruled by it. So now, when you walk away, you do it calmly, quietly, without grand exits, without long speeches. You leave the performance. You exit the loop. You go still. And in that stillness, you reclaim everything they tried to take. Your voice, your clarity, your sense of self. You don't need to announce your evolution. You don't need them to understand your silence. You don't need their applause. You're not silent because you're broken. You're silent because you're finally whole. And that is the loudest statement you'll ever make. Welcome to the new era of strength. It doesn't roar. It simply refuses to bow. If this message resonates with you, if you've ever found strength in stillness, clarity in silence, or strength in peace, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below and tell us, what does silence mean to you? And if you're on the silent path to inner freedom and resilience, we invite you to like, subscribe, and join this community of thinkers, healers, and warriors of peace. This is more than a channel. It's a movement. People who stopped performing and started living. Subscribe to the channel to see the latest videos. Thank you.